Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. Waves crashed rhythmically against the shore, their steady cadence a stark contrast to the tumultuous emotions brewing inside the modest beach house perched on the cliff above. Inside, tension crackled through the air like static electricity. Gidget stood defiantly before her father, her frame vibrating with barely contained frustration. Her sun-bleached blonde hair hung in damp tendrils around her face, still damp from her morning surf session. "But Dad, you're being totally unreasonable!" Gidget's voice rose an octave, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Biff isn't some delinquent. He's a good guy." Her father, Lawrence, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and stern blue eyes, crossed his arms over his chest. His jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek as he struggled to maintain his composure. "I don't care if he's the second coming of Christ, young lady. You're not seeing him anymore, and that's final." Gidget's eyes flashed dangerously. "You can't do this! I'm 20 years old for crying out loud! I'm not some child you can order around!" The color drained from Lawrence's face, replaced quickly by a deep crimson that crept up his neck and suffused his cheeks. "That's enough! I won't stand here and listen to this filth! You're grounded, young lady! No beach, no surfing, and absolutely no Biff!" Gidget's mouth fell open in shock. "Grounded? Are you kidding me? I'm an adult." "Then start acting like one," Lawrence roared, his patience finally snapping. "Go to your room, now!" For a moment, Gidget looked as though she might argue further, but then her shoulders slumped in defeat, and she turned on her heel, stomping up the stairs to her bedroom. The door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the pictures on the walls. Lawrence exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. He hated fighting with his daughter, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this Biff character was bad news. If only she could see things from his perspective. Upstairs, Gidget flung herself onto her bed, burying her face in her pillow to muffle a scream of frustration. Hot tears pricked at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. It wasn't fair. Her dad just didn't understand. He couldn't see how special Biff was, how kind and gentle he could be. Rolling onto her back, Gidget stared up at the ceiling, tracing the familiar patterns in the plaster with her eyes. If only there was some way to make her father understand, to help him see things from her point of view. Suddenly, she sat bolt upright, her eyes wide. The old leather-bound book her grandmother had given her for her birthday last year, the one full of strange symbols and incantations. At the time, Gidget had dismissed it as a novelty, a silly remnant of her grandmother's eccentricities. But what if... Heart-pounding, Gidget slid off the bed and crept to her closet. She rummaged through boxes of old clothes and surfing magazines until her fingers brushed against worn leather. Pulling the book out, she blew a thin layer of dust from its cover. "This is crazy," she muttered to herself, flipping through the yellowed pages. Magic isn't real. It can't be. But as her eyes skimmed over the arcane symbols and cryptic phrases, a tingling sensation began to spread through her fingertips. It was as though the book itself was alive, pulsing with an otherworldly energy. Gidget's breath caught in her throat as she stumbled upon a page titled Empathy Enchantment. The description promised to allow the caster to make another person experience life from a different perspective. It was perfect. With trembling hands, Gidget began to gather the necessary components. A strand of her father's hair, plucked from his comb. A seashell from the beach where she'd first met Biff. A pinch of salt from the ocean. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across her room, Gidget sat cross-legged on the floor. The book lay open before her, candles flickering at each corner of a hastily drawn chalk circle. "This is insane," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "It's not going to work." But even as the words left her lips, Gidget began to recite the incantation. The foreign words felt strange on her tongue, but with each syllable, the air in the room seemed to grow thicker, charged with an invisible energy. The candle flames danced and swayed, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The seashell began to glow with an inner light, and the strand of her father's hair curled and twisted, as though alive. As Gidget spoke the final word of the spell, a blinding flash of light erupted from the center of the circle. She threw her arms up to shield her eyes, crying out in surprise and fear. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. Gidget lowered her arms slowly, blinking spots from her vision. The candles had been extinguished, thin tendrils of smoke curling up from their blackened wicks. The seashell and hair were gone, leaving behind only a faint scorch mark on the wooden floor. For a long moment, Gidget sat in stunned silence, her heart racing. Had it worked? She strained her ears, listening for any sound from downstairs, but the house remained quiet. Slowly, carefully, she rose to her feet. Her legs felt shaky, as though she'd just run a marathon. Gidget crept to her bedroom door and eased it open, peering out into the darkened hallway. "Dad?" she called softly. "Are you okay?" No response. Swallowing hard, Gidget made her way down the stairs. The living room was empty, the kitchen dark. A flicker of movement caught her eye, and she turned to see a figure silhouetted against the sliding glass door that led to the back porch. "Dad?" Gidget said again, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure turned, and Gidget's breath caught in her throat. Where her father had stood only hours before, there was now a woman. She was tall and slender, with the same salt and pepper hair as Lawrence, now falling in soft waves around a delicate, feminine face. The woman's eyes, a familiar shade of blue, were wide with shock and confusion. "Gidget?" The voice that emerged was higher, softer, but unmistakably her father's. What's happening to me?" Gidget's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes growing impossibly wide. "Oh my God," she breathed. "It worked! It actually worked!" Lawrence, or rather the woman who had been Lawrence, stumbled forward, nearly tripping over feet that suddenly seemed too small. "What worked? Gidget, what did you do?" Guilt and fear warred in Gidget's chest as she watched her father struggle to maintain balance. This wasn't what she'd intended. The spell was supposed to give him understanding, empathy, not physically transform him. I just wanted you to understand," Gidget stammered, backing away as her father advanced. "To see things from my perspective. I didn't mean for this to happen." Lawrence's new face contorted with a mixture of confusion and growing anger. "What are you talking about? What did you do to me?" Before Gidget could respond, Lawrence caught sight of his reflection in the hall mirror. A strangled gasp escaped his lips as she took in the drastic changes. Trembling hands rose to touch the softened jaw, the fuller lips. "This isn't possible," Lawrence whispered, voice cracking. "It can't be real." Gidget watched, paralyzed with a mixture of fascination and horror, as her father explored his new body. Lawrence's movements were jerky, uncoordinated, as though he was a puppet whose strings had been abruptly cut and retied. "Dad, I'm so sorry," Gidget finally managed to say. "I found this old spell book and I don't know what I thought. I just wanted you to understand me better." Lawrence's head snapped up, blue eyes blazing with a fury that looked alien on his new, softer features. "A spell book? Magic? Have you lost your mind, Gidget? This isn't some beach party movie. This is real life." "I know it sounds crazy, but crazy doesn't even begin to cover it." Lawrence's voice rose to a shrill pitch that would have been comical under different circumstances. "Change me back. Right now." Gidget's stomach dropped. I don't know how," she admitted in a small voice. The color drained from Lawrence's face. "What do you mean you don't know how? You did this. You have to undo it." "The spell didn't say anything about reversing it," Gidget said, her voice trembling. "I didn't think it would actually work, let alone do this." Lawrence opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a wave of dizziness seemed to wash over him. He staggered, reaching out to brace himself against the wall. "Dad?" Gidget rushed forward, supporting her father's unfamiliar form. "Are you okay?" Lawrence's eyes were unfocused, his breathing rapid and shallow. "I feel strange," he murmured. "Everything's different. Off balance." Gidget helped Lawrence to the couch, easing him down onto the cushions. Her father's new body felt alien under her hands, softer, more pliable. It was disconcerting, to say the least. "Just take deep breaths," Gidget instructed, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. "I'll get you some water." As she hurried to the kitchen, Gidget's mind raced. What had she done? How could she fix this? The spell book hadn't mentioned any time limit or reversal process. For all she knew, her father could be stuck like this forever. When she returned with a glass of water, she found Lawrence examining his hands, turning them over and studying the more delicate bones and slender fingers. "This is impossible," he muttered, flexing his fingers experimentally. "People don't just change gender overnight. It defies all logic, all science." Gidget handed him the water, careful not to meet his eyes. "I know it doesn't make sense, Dad, but it happened. And I promise I'll find a way to change you back." Lawrence took a sip of water, grimacing slightly. Even the act of swallowing seemed different in this new body. "And what if you can't? What then, Gidget? How am I supposed to live like this?" He gestured at his transformed body, frustration evident in every movement. "We'll figure it out," Gidget said, trying to inject confidence she didn't feel into her voice. Maybe it'll wear off on its own?" Lawrence barked out a laugh that sounded strange coming from his new, feminine vocal cords. "Oh, of course, because that's how magic works, right? It just wears off." Gidget flinched at the bitterness in her father's tone. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for this to happen. I just wanted—" "You just wanted what?" Lawrence snapped. "To teach me a lesson? To punish me for not letting you see that boy? Well, congratulations, Gidget. Lesson learned." Tears welled up in Gidget's eyes. "That's not what I wanted at all. I thought if you could see things from a different perspective, maybe you'd understand why Biff is so important to me." Lawrence's expression softened slightly, a flicker of the father Gidget knew shining through the unfamiliar features. "Gidget, honey, I understand that Biff is important to you, but that doesn't change the fact that I think he's bad news." "But why?" Gidget pressed, seizing the moment of calm. "What is it about him that bothers you so much?" Lawrence sighed, running a hand through his longer hair, a gesture so familiar yet so strange in this new form. "It's not just Biff, specifically. It's boys in general. I remember what it was like to be a young man, Gidget. The thoughts that go through your head, the urges." He trailed off, a flush creeping up his neck. "I just want to protect you, to keep you safe." Gidget's heart softened at the vulnerability in her father's voice. "Dad, I appreciate that. I do. But I'm not a little girl anymore. I can take care of myself." "Can you?" Lawrence challenged, his new features set in a determined expression. "Do you really understand what you're getting into with Biff?" Gidget opened her mouth to retort, but before she could, Lawrence suddenly doubled over, a gasp of pain escaping his lips. "Dad, what's wrong?" Gidget leaned forward, her hand hovering uncertainly over her father's shoulder. Lawrence's face was contorted in discomfort, one arm wrapped around his midsection. "I don't know," he ground out. "It feels like cramps, but worse than any stomachache I've ever had." Gidget's eyes widened as realization dawned. "Oh no," she breathed. "Dad, I think you might be experiencing your first period." Lawrence's head snapped up, horror etched across his delicate features. "My first what?" "Your period," Gidget repeated, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. It's a monthly thing that women go through. It can be pretty uncomfortable." "Monthly?" Lawrence echoed weakly. "You mean this happens every month?" Gidget nodded, avoiding her father's incredulous gaze. "Yeah, welcome to womanhood, I guess?" Lawrence groaned, curling in on himself as another wave of cramps hit. This is awful. How do you deal with this?" "Heat helps," Gidget said, standing up. I'll get you a hot water bottle and some painkillers." As she busied herself in the kitchen, heating water and rummaging through the medicine cabinet, Gidget's mind whirled. This was so much more complicated than she'd anticipated. It wasn't just about changing her father's body. He was experiencing all the physical and emotional realities of being a woman. When she returned to the living room, she found Lawrence sprawled on the couch, one arm flung dramatically over his eyes. "Here," Gidget said softly, offering the hot water bottle and pills. "This should help." Lawrence accepted them gratefully, pressing the warm bottle against his abdomen with a sigh of relief. "I had no idea," he murmured. "I mean, I knew women experienced this, but I never realized how intense it could be." Gidget perched on the edge of the coffee table, watching her father with a mixture of sympathy and lingering guilt. "Yeah, it's not exactly a walk in the park, but you learn to deal with it." Lawrence was quiet for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. When he spoke again, his voice was soft, almost wondering. "Is this what it's always like? Being a woman, I mean. Feeling vulnerable, out of control of your own body?" Gidget considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But it's not all bad. There's a strength in it too, you know? Learning to work with your body, to understand its rhythms and changes." Lawrence nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I suppose I never really considered that before. It's eye-opening, to say the least." A small smile tugged at Gidget's lips. "Well, that was kind of the point of the spell. To give you a new perspective." Lawrence shot her a wry look. "I think this might be taking the concept a bit far, don't you?" Gidget laughed softly, relieved to see a glimmer of her father's usual humor. "Yeah, maybe a little. I really am sorry, Dad. I promise I'll find a way to fix this." "I know you will, sweetheart," Lawrence said, reaching out to pat her hand. The gesture was so familiar, yet so strange coming from this new feminine form. "In the meantime, I suppose I'll have to make the best of it. Though I have to say, I'm not looking forward to figuring out how to use the bathroom in this body." Gidget's eyes widened in horror. "Oh God, I didn't even think about that. Maybe we should call Mom? She might be able to help with some of the practical aspects." Lawrence's face paled. "Your mother? Gidget, how exactly do you propose we explain this situation to her?" "Well, we have to tell her something," Gidget reasoned. "She's going to notice when she comes home and finds her husband turned into a woman." Lawrence groaned, burying his face in his hands. This is a nightmare. An absolute nightmare. As if on cue, the sound of a key turning in the lock echoed through the house. Both Gidget and Lawrence froze, eyes wide with panic. "Hello? Anyone home?" Betty's cheerful voice called out as the front door swung open. Lawrence shot Gidget a desperate look. "Quick, hide me!" But it was too late. Betty rounded the corner, a bag of groceries in her arms. She stopped short at the sight before her, her daughter perched awkwardly on the coffee table and a strange woman sprawled on the couch, clutching a hot water bottle. "Oh!" Betty exclaimed, surprise evident in her voice. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize we had company." "Gidget, who's your friend?" Gidget and Lawrence exchanged a panicked glance. This was going to be interesting, to say the least. Mom?" Gidget began, her voice shaky. "You might want to sit down for this." Betty's brow furrowed in confusion, but she set the groceries down and took a seat in the armchair. "What's going on? Is everything all right?" Lawrence took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was sure to be an incredibly awkward conversation. "Betty, honey, it's me, Lawrence." Betty's eyes widened, darting between the unfamiliar woman on the couch and her visibly uncomfortable daughter. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "It's Dad," Gidget jumped in, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I know it sounds crazy, but there was this spell, and I was just trying to make him understand me better, and somehow it turned him into a woman, and I'm so sorry." A heavy silence fell over the room as Betty processed this information. Her gaze locked onto Lawrence, studying the familiar eyes in the unfamiliar face. "Lawrence," she whispered, disbelief coloring her tone. "Is that really you?" Lawrence nodded, a wry smile twisting his now feminine features. In the flesh. Well, sort of. Betty's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. But how? This isn't possible. Trust me, I've been saying the same thing all evening, Lawrence said dryly. Gidget watched nervously as her mother struggled to come to terms with the bizarre situation. Would she be angry? Horrified? Would she blame Gidget for this magical mishap? To everyone's surprise, a small giggle escaped Betty's lips. The giggle grew into a chuckle, and soon she was doubled over, tears of laughter streaming down her face. Mom? Gidget ventured cautiously. Are you okay? Betty wiped her eyes, still chuckling. Oh, I'm sorry. It's just... Well, you have to admit it's a little funny. My husband turned into a woman by our daughter's magical misadventure. It sounds like something out of one of those beach party movies you love so much, Gidget. Lawrence's mouth fell open in indignation. I fail to see the humor in this situation, Betty. This only set Betty off again, her laughter filling the room. Oh, darling, I'm sorry. It's just, well, you always did say you wished you understood women better. Be careful what you wish for, I suppose. Despite himself, Lawrence felt a reluctant smile tugging at his lips. Trust Betty to find the absurd humor in an impossible situation. As her mother's laughter subsided, Gidget felt some of the tension drain from her shoulders. Maybe, just maybe, they could get through this together. So, Betty said, wiping away the last of her tears. What's the plan? How do we change you back? Lawrence and Gidget exchanged a glance. We're not entirely sure, Gidget admitted. The spell book didn't say anything about reversing it. Betty's eyebrows shot up. Spell book? Gidget, where on earth did you get a spell book? Grandma gave it to me, Gidget mumbled, suddenly fascinated by a loose thread on her shorts. For my birthday last year? Betty's eyes narrowed. My mother gave you a book of actual working spells. Oh, she and I are going to have words. Can we focus on the more pressing issue here? Lawrence interjected, gesturing at his transformed body. Like how I'm supposed to live like this? Betty's expression softened as she took in her husband's distress. Of course, dear. We'll figure this out together. In the meantime, well, I suppose we'll have to get you some more appropriate clothes and maybe give you a crash course in feminine hygiene. Lawrence blanched at the thought. This is going to be a nightmare, isn't it? Oh, it won't be so bad, Betty said, a mischievous twinkle in her eye. Think of it as an adventure. You always said you wanted to understand women better. Now's your chance. As her parents began to discuss the practicalities of Lawrence's new situation, Gidget slipped out of the room. Her head was spinning with the events of the evening, guilt and worry warring in her chest. She had to find a way to reverse the spell. But as she climbed the stairs to her room, a small part of her couldn't help but wonder, what if this experience really did help her father understand her better? What if, in some strange way, this magical mishap brought them closer together? With a sigh, Gidget pushed open her bedroom door. The spell book lay where she'd left it, innocent-looking despite the chaos it had caused. She picked it up, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. Okay, Grandma, she murmured. What other secrets are you hiding in here? And more importantly, how do I fix this mess? As she settled onto her bed, book in hand, Gidget couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a very strange and potentially enlightening adventure for her family. For better or worse, things would never be quite the same again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.